our first speaker tonight is Travis Jones of TBJ Legal Consulting. Travis has over 15 years in law enforcement, over 7 with military law, and currently instructs military bases, police departments. I'll let you tell you. I'll let him fill you in on all of his accolades, but Travis has a unique skill set. Number one, he has the law enforcement background. Number two, has a wild mind for numbers, and those two together has made him an expert in the field in crash data reconstruction and CDR data analysis. Without any further ado, I'd love to brag on him all night, but if you please give a round of applause for Travis Jones.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll give you just a brief history. I started in St. Louis City Police, 1995, and then went to St. Charles County here in Missouri in 1998. One of my goals after I started law enforcement was to get into accident reconstruction, also doing a little bit more into the impaired driving. Part of those details that went into being into that unit, which was called vehicle crash investigation, is you had to learn about crash data retrieval, which is starting to become a brand new field as far as the technology that the cars have. I stayed in law enforcement until the end of 2009. And then I went to work for the Marine Corps as a subject matter expert and curriculum developer. So I developed training for the military police, civilian police officers on a contract basis. And since 2016, have pretty much contracted myself through my own traffic safety company. Done expert testimony throughout the United States. I work in a variety of fields for impaired driving and also speed measurement and also accident reconstruction. Today, we're going to be talking about crash data retrieval. Talk a little bit about our objectives. Hold on, if this goes. Keep going on. Wait, hold on.
Can I just pull this over here? Can I do this for you?
You can do that all. I'm going to keep going. So I'm going to go on the next screen. We're going to talk about a little bit about the objectives. Here they are. What is crash data retrieval and what it does? I'm going to talk a little bit about what the technology is, what it's used for, how it can be helpful in some sense, how the expectations sometimes are not what you really want, and where we're going in the future with it. We'll talk about the modules. I actually brought 2 of them with it, but I have pictures of the modules. One of them looks like this. This is the actual airbag control module coming out of a vehicle. We're going to talk about these and what the modules contain, the technology behind them, what they can actually help us learn from a vehicle crash, and the limitations. This is another module, but a little bit different. This is called a powertrain control module. This is within the engine. Anybody ever had a warning light come on their car? Flash a light up there, and you're wondering, what the hell does this mean? A lot of it comes off of these modules, especially this one being the powertrain control module, when it senses if something is wrong on the car and therefore activates one of those signs. But it also gives data that's contained on here is going to go over to this module to decide whether or not it needs to save your life or not, or whether or not it's going to just let you crash and not save your life. So these modules have to communicate with each other in the car for a decision of what they should do if the vehicle decides to flip, crash into the back of a tractor trailer, or start rotating in directions that you were not steering in. Talk a little bit about the legal aspects, because there are some ramifications as far as what these modules contain, but who has access to them. You may think, well, it's my car. If it's in a crash and I have the rights whether or not I want that module's data to go out to somebody or not. Has anybody ever done a State Farm app? I think Progressive does it, where you actually put something on your car to read your driving safe ability. So if you have one of those, one of the things to consider is if you get involved in an incident where you may be investigated or you may have some civil liability, that data from that app or from that snap-on that goes onto the vehicle could actually be subpoenaed and used to determine whether you were at fault for causing the crash of a vehicle. So we're going to talk about legal ramifications, what that data means, how it can come out and be used, and the other vehicle technology. Does anybody have a map system on their car? OnStar, any of those things. All the data is contained on those could also be something that can be used to find you if you are in danger, can be used to help clear you if you are accused of doing something wrong. And we're going to go through a lot about the technology that the cars have and how they're used on the criminal, but also on the civil side to help you out. What is crash data retrieval? We have the airbag control module, referred to as an ACM, or you'll sometimes see it referred to as an EDR, which is an event data recorder. Depending upon who makes the car, Ford, GM, Toyota, Subaru, sometimes you'll see a different name of what someone's referring to. Sometimes it may be an ABCM as opposed to an ACM, or it may be an EDR, referred to as an event data recorder. They're all the same. This is the brain that decides whether or not to deploy your airbags out and whether or not the seatbelts need to be tightened to secure you into it during the crash. So they're receiving all the information into the module, and then the module decides, does the airbag need to deploy? Front airbag, side airbag, depends upon the model of the car. It depends on what's going on the crash itself. The other module is referred to as a powertrain control module, as a PCM. That's going to be the engine control module. Other types of vehicles are going to have these, heavy-duty trucks, tractor trailers. They are all going to have something that's going to be attached into the engine that's going to have data on it that can be retrieved. Cases I've been involved in where they looked at how fast the tractor trailer was going. Did it brake prior to the accident? There's all sorts of information that can be contained on that powertrain control module that can be retrieved and looked at. Sometimes it's referred to as a black box. Everybody's seen that? They talk about the black box of a vehicle. Okay, big difference between a black box on a plane versus a black box that's on your car. The black box that's on a plane is designed to record data for engineers and safety specialists and investigators to look at, to determine what happened or what may have gone wrong during a crash of an airplane. The airbag control module, what we sometimes refer to as a black box in the vehicle, is designed to decide whether or not to deploy the airbags out. There are safety features of the vehicle. It's not designed in the sense of, hey, I want to store all this information to decide whether or not later you are at fault or not. The purpose of the black box in the car is to decide whether or not to deploy the airbags out or tighten the seatbelts. So there's a big difference in what's recording. Other things that may have a recorder on them, besides the plane, if you look at trains are a big one. They have a true black box on there. It records everything that train is doing because it can decide later whether or not that train had done something that was in air. Access to what's in that train belongs to whoever owns the train. So we'll talk about the cars issue, but with the car issue that goes on, the fact is it may be your car, but it's not something you have access to. Unless you bought special equipment to download the data out of that module, you technically can't get in to retrieve what that module says. If the insurance company takes possession of a total vehicle, then maybe the insurance company can say, well, we bought the vehicle, so now we own the module that's in there. But the module could actually be belonging to whoever built the car or built the module. The data that is on these is going to be limited, particularly by the year and the make and the model. This is my magic book. This contains a list of vehicles that contain different codes, different analysis. Someone calls and says, I was involved in a crash. My client was involved in a crash. It's an insurance company said, we have this crash involving this type of vehicle. Is it possible to get any information off of this embed data recorder. Then I go to this book, and then I also usually contact one or two other experts in the field to see what we need to do to get things done. I'll give you an example. There are certain Ford Mustangs out there, depending upon the year, there may not be any access to unless you actually send the module to the Ford manufacturing company. Ford is the only one that has an access to. Other Ford Mustangs, depending on which year it is, they're listed in here. And if you own the cable and the software, then you can download it and you can get the information off it. You don't have to send it to Ford. If anybody's interested, the book will be passed around. It kind of has everything in there. Just make sure I get it back at the end in case someone calls me tomorrow. There are two ways, and we're going to get into the details, but particularly two different ways with this information, how they can be retrieved. One is directly from one of the modules here. The cables can be connected into the back. You have to figure out where this module is at. As you look through that binder, it kind of tells you. If you're on some cars, this module is in the center tunnel, maybe under the gear shift or very up toward the front, underneath where the radio is. It could be underneath one of these seats, passenger side, driver side. So you have to be able to get to the access. Part of the problems is usually the car has been smashed, parts have been torn apart, fire department has come in to cut out parts and get people out, it's been towed. Sometimes this module is buried or wrapped around steel. So then you have to figure out a way to remove this out and then take it in, and you can take this module and put it on a desktop and connect your cables. Yes?
So we have a question from a viewer. So are newer Mustangs versus older Mustangs, which are easier to pull forensic data from?
If you can get the newer Mustangs are obviously going to be easier because of technology changes that they've started to switch. There's now requirements that the modules and what is contained on them and the access that can be given to them. So they've made them more easier with the newer models. Some of the older models, you can only have a Ford technician or Ford person go in and take a look at that data and retrieve any of the information. So they're talking about one way is this module. If you can get to it, you can connect in the cable in the car. You can take this out of the car, set it on what's referred to as a tabletop, and retrieve the data out that way. Or you have, underneath your steering wheel, you'll see a DLC. It's basically a connector port that's in the vehicle that's located underneath the steering wheel on the dash part. You can connect a cable into it, and if you have the proper cable and it works for that type of vehicle, you don't even have to get into the module. You can access this data through that port. However, there's some key things about this to remember. One is you have to be able to power up the vehicle in order to access through certain ports. You also have to hope that nothing has been destroyed. I said this is used for one thing. It's a safety feature. It's not designed to necessarily have information to clear you in a civil action, but it's designed for safety. So what this module, to remember, is it's taking data, deciding whether to deploy the airbag. So there's two types of events that occur. One is referred to as a non-deployment, and the other one is a deployment. A non-deployment event means is that you were driving along and suddenly traffic slowed down in front of you and you slammed on the brakes. And it woke up the system to say, do I need to deploy the airbag to save the driver's life or not? And it decided that basically nothing occurred, did not need to deploy the airbag, and you have what's referred to as a non-deployment event that's now occurred. That non-deployment event may stay on this module for access until the next event occurs, or it'll erase itself off. Okay? So it's not designed to keep a log or maintain a memory. The ones that are locked into the memory is going to be the deployment of the airbag. So if you're driving along and someone pulls right out in front of you, you slam on the brakes and the front end goes right into the side of that car. And the airbags deploy out. The module, the data that it gathered to decide to deploy the airbag is now going to be kept on the memory of the module. So even if you turn it off, do anything as far as with battery disconnect or whatever, that memory should be able to keep that event so that it can be looked at to see why the airbag went off, did it work properly, and it will also record other information.
Is that threshold different depending on the make and model, or are those parts standard in most cars?
Is more toward the year of the vehicle. We're looking anything from about 2010, 2011 forward is going to be a standard set of information. Anything previous, we do not know. So you look back in early or late 90s vehicle, we'll probably have a airbag control module, but there was no requirement to keep any of the data. And the only data you may find on there is the RPMs of the engine, whether the brake switch was on, and that will be it. Data that's now contained on the cars that we're seeing coming out, the speed of the vehicle for the previous 5 seconds before the airbag deployed. The brake switch, was it on or not? Was the seatbelt being worn or not? There will be RPMs on the engine. Was there any warning lights? Has anybody ever turned on their car and they see the airbag light come on and then it turns off? If the airbag light comes on and then it flashes and then stops, the number of flashes tells you the code of what's wrong with your airbag system. That's how that airbag system works. Everyone has a standardized that if what number of flashes tells you what the code is that's wrong with your airbag system. One of the other things to consider is the recalls. Anybody remember hearing about the issues that all the airbags are being recalled? People were getting hurt because of airbag deployments. National Highway Traffic Safety Administration maintains a recall system. So if a vehicle is involved in a crash and you want to know whether or not the airbag was recalled, is it possible that there was a mechanical failure that caused a wreck? You can go in and enter in the vehicle identification number, and it gives you the recall information to tell you whether there was a recall on the airbag system. Go ahead, go to the next one. Okay. Here's a picture of an airbag control unit, SRS unit. Okay. Taken out of a vehicle. Look at the connecting ports on the bottom. This one, pretty simple. They are designed to try and survive as much as possible. We talked earlier about the seatbelt information that's contained. Why is it important to know whether or not the seatbelt was on or off with the airbag? What happens if you're in a fronting collision? What is your body as a driver going to do if that seatbelt is not being worn? Are you going to go forward or backwards? You're going forward. So think if you're going forwards, and just as you get to the steering wheel, the airbag decides to deploy out into your face as you're going that far forward, you're right out an inch away. It's going to cause severe head trauma. So the timing of when the airbag goes off depends upon whether the seatbelt is being worn or not. If the seatbelt's being worn, it knows it can deploy the airbag faster because you're not going forward into a dangerous position for airbag deployment. Okay, yes?
One of our viewers asked, do these devices log connectivity data from mobile phones or Bluetooth?
No. There's no, this time there's no technology that's going to connect it in because it's going to be protected under the whoever manufactures it. So one of the things to remember is this may be, we'll take a Ford Mustang as an example. Ford Mustang and its Ford vehicle. This airbag unit is going to be, or airbag is going to be contracted out to another supplier to provide to Ford to put into the vehicle. So it's going to come in third hand or fourth hand. That's some of the things to remember when you think about it, you hear about a recall on something. It doesn't necessarily mean that Ford manufactured it. It means that Ford bought that product, put it in the vehicle, or Toyota bought that product, put it in the vehicle from another source, and that may be where that recall is coming from. Next one. Here's what a Ford event data recorder looks like. I'm sorry, this one's going to be the powertrain. I think. Hold on. No, that's going to be the Ford one. So these three holes are going to be bolted down into the frame of the vehicle. take an example of it's in a center tunnel. So underneath your center console, if you ripped off the center console and underneath there, this is what you found. You now have to get to these 3 holes with the socket wrench and then successfully be able to remove the 3 screws in order to remove and pull this unit out. Next one. Here's another Ford one. This one's an older one with the blue one. Limited data that you may have on that's going to help. Here is a newer module. Again, 3 holes connected in. If you think about something in the center console or underneath that radio, they're going to put this thing and mount it on the frame, and then over the top is going to come everything else. So then think you have to figure out how to get your socket wrench in there, move these out, then probably pry and push everything out of the way. And then coming off of where the ports are at, you'll see these cables. You're going to have to get in there and figure out how to snip them off. So if there's access into the port underneath the steering wheel, the data is much easier to retrieve than having to remove a whole module and then do it that way off of what's called a desktop or tabletop. Another look at a module that's been put in there. That's the underside of it. What do you think, even looking at these pictures, would it survive an intense fire? Probably not. Number of classes I've been through where we've tried to pull something out. One where a car that was buried in a lake for a number of years, I think it was 15 years, maybe 10 years. They pulled the module out to see if whether or not they could get any information off the module. It was just an attempt. The water damage was so bad you couldn't get anything out of it. Another one, somebody put it into salt water. I've been in salt water for about 5 years. They pulled out the car. There was nothing on there. There was a case a number of years ago. I'm trying to think now. We're about 12 years ago. Intense fire. It melted the entire box. When they called us in to investigate to take a look at it, the box was completely melted. There's the fire had been that hot in vehicles. There was no information that could be gathered off of it. Next one. Go ahead and keep through. This is a close-up of the port on the back. This is where it would connect in with the cables. It looks pretty primitive. That's where they're designed for durability. Also remember, if you are the Toyota company, when you are buying, we'll say 100,000 of these modules, are you going to go with the most expensive or the least expensive, considering you have to buy 100,000 of these to put in your Toyota Corollas or Toyota Camrys? On a cost thing, you're going to go with whatever's going to be the lowest bid, but it's still going to meet your specifications of what's going to be needed. So the thing to remember is these are bought for the purpose of deciding whether or not the airbag was going to go out there or not. Its ability whether to retrieve and save that information is not the first priority. These are designed as a safety feature. One of the things also that's contained in this information is whether the seatbelt pretensioner, sorry about that, was fired off. Well, what that means is when you put your seatbelt on, if it recognizes, hey, we're going into a crash, and there is a danger that the passenger or the driver will be hurt, what it will do is it will tighten the seatbelt up to keep you restrained. So if you're traveling at 75 miles an hour down a turnpike, and suddenly the tractor trailer comes out in front of you, and the crash begins, and within milliseconds, it fires the seatbelt off to stop it and restrain you in there and put the airbag off. The airbag's deployed, the seatbelt's deployed and tightened up. And remember, you're going 75 miles an hour, and now you're coming to a complete stop when you hit the back of that tractor trailer. What is not stopped? The brain. So remember, your brain inside your head was going to speed, and suddenly on a sudden stop, your brain will slide forward and will hit into the skull. So even though we have all these safety features and you have this engineering and this module that's going to help save you as much as possible, the faster you go, the more damage that can be done to the body. Even with an airbag deployed, even with a seatbelt, there are severe enough crashes that the person is not going to survive. You see, someone says that there's a crash involved and the person was ejected. What's your first thought? What happens if the person's ejected out of the car? What do they not have on? The seatbelt. The system is designed to protect the driver. Anyone, I hope no one has ever done this, but there are people in the past that don't like that seatbelt or being restrained, but they don't like the angry reminder that comes out from the vehicle if you don't have your seatbelt on, right? Starts beeping at you, flashing at you. So I take the seatbelt and I'll put it behind my back and I'll snap it in. What's the danger with that? Technology is designed for what? For safety. So if you're not wearing the seatbelt and it thinks you are wearing the seatbelt and you get involved in a crash, you are now an inch away from when that airbag gets deployed out and put into your face. Because you had it behind the back instead of wearing it properly. That is something else that as you look at the data that's contained on the module versus the injuries of the person versus the vehicle's damage and the crash that's on it, you can now put together all that information together to successfully say what happened and what didn't happen. Did the system save the driver? Did it not save the driver? If it did not, what was the cause of that? So we talked about locations. It's usually sometimes will be up near the firewall, sometimes underneath the front seats, driver, passenger. There are other modules that are out there that may be inside the vehicle. So you need to make sure if you're understanding you're looking for it, there can be upwards of 21 modules contained on the vehicle. You're looking for what's referred to as an airbag control module or an event data recorder for that safety information that's contained, or the powertrain control module, which will be in the engine. What is a report? It's multiple pages. It contains hexadecimal data. So it contains the raw data, the event that's occurred or the non-deployment which occurred, the number of times the ignition has been turned. And what I'll tell you is two different parts. One, it will say when the event occurred. So when the crash occurred, it'll tell you how many times the car had been turned on. And then it will tell you that when you downloaded the material or downloaded the data out of this module, it'll tell you how many cycles have been. So if you notice there's a large difference in numbers, that means that somebody was going in and moving and restarting the car back and forth. Law enforcement is an investigation tool. It assists in as far as possibly what the speed of the vehicle was. Was there braking? Does it match up with information that's obtained from the scene? Does it correspond with what witnesses and drivers had said that which occurred? To get the information, there usually has to be a search warrant or consent given to retrieve that information from this airbag control module. It can be preserved for later use. Information that it may contain, and this is, remember, it's may. Not all vehicles are going to be the same. Speed, change in velocity, and this is delta V. There are three axes that it uses. Originally it used an XY axis to determine what the vehicle was doing, to determine whether or not if the vehicle started to rotate sideways or anticipated a crash, would a side airbag come down? And it realized that it needed more information because if the vehicle started to rotate or flip over, it needed to assess that as to what safety features need to go out. So it actually operates on a Z-axis also. So it's analyzing data from the vehicle along the front to back, side to side, and then down to center. So it can tell if your vehicle starts to rotate or spin and what safety feature needs to be done. It'll do the brake, the engine throttle, the seatbelt use, whether the pretensioners went off, number of engine cycles, the RPMs, the type of deployment. Said it's either going to be a non-deployment or deployment event is what's going to be recorded on there. Any data collected needs to be supported by on-scene facts. Very important thing. There's no date or time stamp on any of this. There is nothing on there tied in to tell you when this event was recorded or when this data came out. I'll give you an example. You're driving down the highway and you veer off to the right and you hit a curb. You go over the curb, go down the embankment, go over another curb, go across center divider, go up over the curb, through somebody's yard and into the house. And you end up with an airbag deployment being recorded. And you're looking at 5 seconds previous data. When did it start the 5 seconds worth of data? Did it start it when you first went over the first curb, went off the side of the highway and began going down the embankment? Was that the 5 seconds after you hit the center median before you crossed it, went into the person's yard? Or did it not start that 5 second worth of data until you had it come into impact with the building? Remember, there's no date or time stamp. So all this data that you have stored on here now needs to be compared with what was recorded at the scene or what damage is on the vehicle to see if it applies. And where does it apply within the investigation or the events of the car? There's no date or time stamp. There are several types of training that can be given on this. You have what's referred to as technician training. You have what's referred to as analyst training, and then you have instructor training. I've been through all three. It's a constant evolution of new data, new cables. It's very getting more and more complicated because more and more vehicles are being added to the list. Every vehicle is different. So if you go out and you buy one set of cables and one module and you're saying, you're like, great, I have everything, you may only be able to get into maybe 3 or 4 cars. You may need to go out and buy a whole toolbox full of cables. Right now, for a full investment into all the cables and all the software put together, you're talking roughly an estimation of $15,000 to $20,000 just to have the hardware to begin to work right there. And then that'll change every year that you'll need to buy new cables for new cars, different modules. Case law on this issue, courts have looked at this issue. Who belongs to the data? The best thing that they can recommend right now is that even though you may own the car, since you don't have access to it, you can't necessarily give consent to it. Different manufacturers, different courts will look at it different. So one thing I always do is consult legal authority before you access data on any vehicle, or be sure you receive consent from a valid owner. Next. Case law continued. Nothing really here in Missouri yet as far as the courts. There's been case law over in Ohio, Illinois, and some federal case law. Go ahead, next one. If you're going to get consent, consent can be determined by the court. So you can go to court and ask them to grant you consent or evidence. When you obtain a search warrant, you need to make sure that the court has a jurisdiction. There's particular and valuable terminology that must be used in order so you don't break the law and get into information that you're not allowed to get into on any vehicle. So if you own the vehicle, say you have OnStar, you need to get your access into it to get that information from them. Next screen. Post-collision investigation, insurance fraud is a big one. This is something that goes on more and more. Think about it, if you're involved in a crash, your airbag deploys, and you take it to the body shop to get fixed. Question?
So one of our viewers said, they're asking, is there a reason timestamps are mandatory in data stores?
They're not, it's just something because it's a safety feature. They're not going to require them to tie in to put actually time and date on any of this information. That would have to be something done by National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to require a date time stamp on that particular data versus information off the powertrain control module, which may carry a date and time stamp, if that makes sense. So it just depends on where you're seeking that information from, depends on where that date and time stamp may come from. Go back a second. Insurance fraud. You take your car in to get it fixed. It's been involved in a crash. Your airbag goes off. You pay for the body shop, put a new airbag in, put a new module in because the module's been spent. However, not saying that people will not be looking for ways to make money illegally or improperly. But if you just went on eBay and typed in, I want to buy a module for an airbag, you could probably buy a module pretty cheap. Would that module necessarily be the right one? Who knows? They put that in and they put on when they bill the insurance company, they bill the insurance company for buying a brand new airbag control module. However, they just went on eBay. So they're committing what's called insurance fraud. Other cases I've been involved in, instead of putting the airbag back in, we had a body shop that was putting styrofoam back in, and then they were super gluing the steering wheel back together. So if you got involved in a crash after expecting the airbag to be fixed and everything, styrofoam would come out to try and save your life, not an airbag. This is something that goes on. This is insurance fraud. This is things that the modules can help with investigations, determine whether or not that the proper module was put back in if there was an event recorded. Other technology, navigation. Any type of navigation that's on there could be used to track it. OnStar is another big one. Scott and I have worked cases before where we looked at for OnStar data to confirm or verify somebody's story as to where they were at, if they were in that vehicle, if the vehicle was present during that time. Cell phone, the cell phone is connected in. Apple CarPlay. Can the data be typed in, information obtained through that cell phone as for location services if it was plugged into the car at that time? To verify whether or not that person was where they were said they were at. So take it in this sense, we talk about date and time stamp. If you had the cell phone data through Apple CarPlay that was tied in, theoretically, location services, if they have you at the intersection of First and Main and shows on the date time stamp that you were at Third and Main within so many seconds, mathematically, we can figure out how long and how fast you were driving to get between those 2 points. So therefore, if someone says, no, I was not speeding, you can pull up the navigation system, the cell phone data, and possibly use those location services going from point A to point B to figure out how fast that car was going. Low jack systems are used. It's getting more and more anti-theft, but they also contain information that would help as far as assistance for technology in the car. The big one now, collision avoidance. How many of you have seen some of that new technology on the newer cars where it slams on the brakes for you if something jumps out in front? If you start to go over to the left, like you're drifting back and forth. So think about it. If you have someone that is in your, was this person at fault for this crash? And their allegation is that they were drifting from left to right, or they were going over onto the shoulder and they almost hit a pedestrian, or they did. And you have a collision avoidance or a lane to detection system. If that data is retrievable off of this vehicle as to how many times that lane avoidance or collision avoidance went off, that can go to showing what the driver's behavior was leading up to the crash or what occurred. Questions, you can call me. My phone number's up there. This is the old one. Now I'll give you a newer one, but that's my old email address. That's no longer good. I'll give you a newer one if someone would like it. Questions about the vehicle technology? Any questions? Go ahead.
So, like, what made you interested in doing this? Was it a near-death experience with that airbag, or just?
What came out was I was at University of Minnesota doing my undergrad. I was doing criminal justice. So that's what my undergrad was in. So I had to do several ride-alongs, and I did it with Minneapolis police. And I rode with their traffic unit. And after going out and working with their traffic unit, I was like, this physics stuff and this accident reconstruction stuff is kind of pretty neat, to go back and put things back together. And that's where it kind of got started on me it fascinated me because going back and actually reconstructing a scene. I went through over here at Chesterfield PD years ago that they taught us how to animate and create accidents into 3D. Use animation to show what actually occurred. That's what really got me going into it. It was just going out when I did my undergrad program, was riding along. I was like, this kind of sounds fun, use math, reconstruct the scene. And then the more I got into it, the crash data retrieval, it helped me in a lot of crashes. And give you an example, as a criminal investigator, when I worked for St. Charles County, I had a case where tractor trailer and car was involved in a fatality crash. It was an awful experience to go through because the family was very distraught, the ones who had been killed. It was on daylight. There was a lot of speculation as to what had occurred and why it had occurred. When I went through, I actually had to write my own formulas to actually figure out how fast the vehicle was going. That was a tractor trailer. So I ended up, and I think it ended up being, I used 32 different formulas to actually finally calculate down to what the speed was of that tractor trailer on the curve. The vehicle that was involved in it, not the tractor trailer, I went through and I calculated based off its marks what its speed was at the point of impact to show that it had not been going too fast. So the truck was the one that was going too fast versus the car. And then I pulled the data off of the car, and it was like, hey, the data matches exactly what I said occurred in my calculations, which is a really good feeling to know, hey, I lined everything up perfectly, and the computer in the car agreed with what I said it had occurred. So that's where I really got into it. I mean, it's never good things when car crashes occur. And that's one thing as I remember going through a number of crashes, is it can really suck for people. Even on non-fatality. Anyone ever been involved in a crash here where they were not hurt at? Was it a major inconvenience though if your car was damaged, you had to go to get it fixed and everything else that occurs? Yeah, it sucks. It's like I have to rearrange my entire schedule because my car is getting fixed. So just remember that if you're not at fault, and somebody's like, well, wait a minute, it seems like I'm getting punished for it. It is. That's just the way the system goes. And that's why I work in the field that I do, is to go back and find out who's at fault and, who should be paying the right amount of money or who should be involved and found licensed, suspended, revoked, or criminally charged. Any other questions? Yes.
Are there any major differences between, say, the U.S. and Europe, or the U.S. and China, as far as regulations or designs of the modules?
Yes, each country's requirements will be different. The U.S. was one of the companies U.S. finally went through and started doing federal regulations. And the reason why it always comes down to this is, realize if you start telling a company, hey, you need to start installing this technology on this vehicle, who's going to pay for a new technology being put on the car? It's going to be the consumer. So every time that you do it, give you an example, over in Europe, there are cars that are standard, automatically having an ignition interlock device on it for detecting alcohol. Now the benefit is their insurance rates are extremely low because that company knows no one's going to be driving this car under the influence because it's got the breath on. So countries are different throughout. Some are better, some are worse. Just depends on your perspective on things. Any other questions?
So you described these units as the decision-making mechanism, right? So are they easy to be tampered with? Can we alter those decisions?
Theoretically, if you wanted to if somebody wanted to get into it, if you wanted to create like a hot shock where you're basically trying to fry the data that's inside the module, one, it would show up, so somebody would know that, yes, this thing had been tampered with. But I'll give you an example. If you instead of going positive, negative, you went negative, positive onto the battery, sometimes on an older vehicle, that could cause some serious problems to the modules or the powertrain control module where it may destroy it. Not always guaranteed that it's going to work, but some of the modules will have some difficulty because they're older and they're not designed the way the newer ones are. But yeah, if somebody wanted to go in and actually tamper with the modules, they could. It's just for an investigator, they would know that something had occurred because there's always a secondary module that's going to tell you what the error code was that came up. Yeah.
How easy is it to hack into these onboard computers? This is cybersecurity, I'm just curious.
So in the modules like an airbag control module or a powertrain control module, will almost be impossible unless you have the proper cables. However, when you get into the navigation systems, the Apple CarPlay, the OnStar, if somebody could go in there and lock in and steal your data because it's dealing off of a Bluetooth or it's dealing off of a technology that can be easily hacked into and logged into. Especially if somebody doesn't have a secure code on their phone and they're using their phone for navigation, you could hack in and retrieve what their actual information was possibly through that. So cybersecurity wise, the modules are pretty secure, but when you get into the navigation and the CarPlay and those types of things, a person could probably hack into if they really wanted to. They're designed not to, but in this day and world, someone's always looking for a way to hack in and get that information.
These guys wouldn't have jobs. if that was the case.
One thing I forgot to mention about the airbags and seatbelt pretensioners, and this came up in the case I was involved in early on. This company, local government, had a policy that if you were not wearing your seatbelt, then you would receive a reprimand onto your employee file. Well, the person was involved in the crash. I was called in to do the investigation with another officer. Our investigation revealed that the officer had not been wearing his seatbelt. So not only did he get a reprimand, but he also lost a year of, or not a year of pay, but he lost his pay raise for the following year. That was their policy. It's not uncommon for companies to have the policies that if the seatbelt's not being worn in the company vehicle, they're not going to cover you. One of the things that workman's comp will tell you is if you're not wearing that seatbelt, they may, and it's a company vehicle, they may not allow workman's comp to be filed, depending upon the state and the laws of those states. So this information that's on there could potentially cost somebody their job or career because they weren't wearing their seatbelt or tampered with the safety device.
Travis, as a career, if anybody were interested in something like this or along the lines, is law enforcement the only path, or are there other outfits out there that hire people specifically for tasks like this?
So like there are various careers beyond law enforcement. National Highway Traffic Safety. You look at companies like Ford and GM are always looking for people that are going to be involved as far as going out. You look, I could come take Enterprises company that's here in St. Louis. And how many hundreds of thousands of cars do they have and how many crashes they may be involved in, that they have to have their own staff to go out to find out whether or not the driver that they had in their vehicle was at fault and whether they have to pay the insurance out, whether the vehicle had a fault and wasn't taken care of. So private industry and government both are always looking for people to be involved in the vehicle safety. We're tied to our cars in the U.S. That's just the fact of life, especially in the Midwest where there's not a lot of public transportation. The vehicle is very predominant, and that's why we have people that are involved constantly in these types of investigations.
What's a good way, like a certification or something that's like a standard route of entry into the field?
Standard route of entry is to usually get into with one of the either private industries or government industries, but what they're going to look for is that you have the college degree or been working within the automobile field, and then they'll send you for the advanced training to get that information. There's a number of engineering firms that contract out and do this type of work, and they will hire people. I'll give you an example. One of the people I work with, he was an aircraft engineer, and after he did his retirement from that, he took that engineer skill set with numbers, transitioned and got hired by a company, and all he does now is analyze this data and then write up reports for attorneys and companies.
Is there like a certification that's good for entry level folks who have maybe have a hard time getting into that initial job?
There is usually you'll see through, and I'll give you an example, there's what's referred to as the Illinois Association of Technical Accident Investigators, the International Police Technologies, or Institute of Police Technology and Management. There's a number of private companies out there that will have training classes to teach you the basics of this. And then you can take that skill and use it in either government or private work. You can use it from there. But you find an organization where they're going to be doing one of those classes, and then you submit and then go through all that information and apply for that.
Would a cybersecurity, either undergrad or master's, be a great segue if you approach these companies and said, here's my background, I'm interested in getting into this? Does that unlock the door for you?
Yes, anything on the technology side, especially because all the vehicles are going computer related, any type of into cybersecurity technology is a huge asset in understanding how these systems work. Cybersecurity, especially now that we're getting more and more into the phone is controlling the car, to give you more and more where we're headed to. If you think about it, you plug that phone in, you can almost do anything from it. Especially distracted driving is an issue.
Last question, do you have to be good at math to like do this? Because I took like elementary statistics.
For analyzing the crash data retrieval and working with technology, no. For if you were going into the calculating a speed off of information obtained from a crash, and using the math in that manner, then yes, you would need that math kind of background and understanding. But on the technology part for the vehicles, no.
Any more questions?
I appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
Travis, thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
That will conclude our first speaker series. Again, thank you to everyone for coming out. I know for the YouTubers, you can't see our crowd here, but we've had a great turnout. Dr. Goschel, thank you very much for hosting this. Dr. Hollins, watching at home, thank you. Professor Abashan, and a special thanks to MCA and the Women in Cybersecurity. Thank you for making this possible. And just again, thanks for taking the time to come speak to us.
Thank you.
Please check us out 2 weeks from now, same time, same channel, and keep in touch. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Greatly appreciate it.